My name is Judith Amoah. I am 47 years old, and on a Wednesday morning, I woke up in a hospital bed, and a nurse told me my husband had been there every day. Not my ex-husband. She said, my husband, Michael Carr. Michael had left 3 years ago. We had been married for 17 years. He had packed his things on a Sunday in November, and he had gone, and I had let him go, and we had not spoken since. I had told myself I had made peace with that. I had not made peace with that. I said, Michael has been here every day. The nurse said, yes, he comes in the morning, he stays for a few hours. He was here yesterday until 4 in the afternoon. He asked us to call him when you woke. I looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then I said, how long have I been here? She said, 6 days. 6 days, and Michael had been there every one of them. Michael, who had not called, not written, not been in any form of contact for 3 years. I said, why does he know I'm here? The nurse looked at me gently. She said, he was your emergency contact. Let me tell you about the collapse first. I am a secondary school head teacher. I had been at work on a Thursday morning, 6 days ago. An ordinary Thursday. Staff briefing at 8, Year 11 assembly at 9, a meeting with a parent at 10:30 that had run long and been difficult in the way that some parent meetings are difficult. I had been walking back to my office when something happened that I have no memory of. I had been told by colleagues that I had simply gone down. No warning, no prior symptoms beyond what I had learned to manage and had been managing for 3 years. The ambulance had come. I had been brought here. I had been unconscious for the most of the 6 days that followed. And Michael had been here. Every morning, every day, for 6 days. For a woman he had walked away from on a Sunday in November 3 years ago.
The nurse called him on 9:40. He arrived at 10:15. I had 35 minutes between the call and his arrival. I used them to decide what I was going to say. I did not decide anything. He came in and he stood in the doorway for a moment, and he looked at me the way you look at someone you have been frightened for, and who is now awake and present and real. He looked older, 3 years older. There were things in his face that had not been there before. I did not know what they were. I recognized them anyway. He sat in the chair beside my bed, the chair he had clearly been sitting in for 6 days, and he said my name. Just that. Judith. And something in me that had been held very tightly for 3 years moved. The object at the center of everything was my phone. Not the phone itself, one entry in my contacts list. Michael Carr, emergency contact. I had never changed it. 3 years of not changing it. 3 years of updating other things, address, GP registration, bank details, the small administrative life of a woman who has reorganized herself after a marriage ends, and never once opening my contacts and removing his name from the emergency contact field on my phone. I had told myself this was oversight. The phone was old, the contacts were cluttered. I had not gotten around to it. I had been lying to myself. I had not changed it because I had not been able to, because some part of me, the part that makes decisions below the level of conscious thought, had known that the reason the marriage ended was not the reason I had told myself, and had held on to his name in one small field in one app on my phone as the only honest thing I had allowed myself in 3 years. He had been my emergency contact. He had come.
The conversation. We did not have it immediately. He was there at 10:15, and we did not talk about what mattered until 13:40, nearly 3.5 hours of other things, how I was feeling, what the doctors had said, whether I was in pain, whether I needed anything. The ordinary, careful conversation of 2 people who know each other very well and are not yet ready to say the thing that is actually there. At 13:40, I asked him how he had known to come every day. He said the hospital had called him on Thursday when I was admitted. He had come immediately, and then he had come back every day because he had not been able to not come back. I said, "You have not been in contact for 3 years." He said, "I know." I said, "Why?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Judith, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you decide whether you want me to leave." I want to pause here, because lying in a hospital bed at 13:40 on a Wednesday, looking at a man I had been married to for 17 years and had not spoken to for 3 years, and hearing him say, "I need to tell you something," is not a moment I had any preparation for. If you have ever been in a room where the real conversation was finally about to happen, drop a comment below. And subscribe right now, because what Michael told me that afternoon is the part that rearranged 3 years. What Michael told me. 6 months ago, he had run into Judith Amoah, a mutual friend from the early years of our marriage. They had had coffee. At some point in the conversation, Diane had said something, not knowing she was saying anything that mattered, that had told Michael what I had never told him. Diane had not known the whole truth. She had known what a handful of people in our wider circle had come to know over 3 years, that Judith was managing something serious, that her health had required significant adjustment, that she had been quieter about it than anyone had expected. Not the diagnosis, not the reason the marriage ended, just the shape of it. Enough that when she mentioned it to Michael over coffee, she had assumed he already knew. She had mentioned my condition in passing, the way you mention something about a mutual friend that you assume the other person already knows. Michael had not known. He had not known because I had not told him. I had received my diagnosis 2 weeks before he left, 2 weeks before I had picked a series of arguments and withdrawn from conversations and made the marriage feel like something that was already over. 2 weeks before I had behaved, deliberately and consistently, like a woman who no longer wanted to be married. I had done it on purpose. I had decided, in the first weeks after the diagnosis, in the shock and the fear and the strange clarity that sometimes arrives with shock, that I would not be the reason Michael Carr did not live his life, that I would not be a condition he managed, that I would not watch him stay out of obligation and slowly become something different from the man he had been. I had made the decision without telling him there was a decision being made. I had pushed him out completely and so convincingly that he believed the marriage was simply over. He had spent 3 years believing I had stopped wanting it. I had spent 3 years believing I had protected him. We had both been wrong. We had both been right, and neither of us had known what the other one was carrying. The silence after he finished. I do not know how long it was. Long enough that a nurse came to the doorway and looked in and left again. I had spent 3 years constructing a version of what had happened that I could live inside, a version where I had made the hard choice, where I had loved him enough to let him go, where the cost had been mine to pay and I had paid it with my eyes open. All of that was true. And it had also cost him 3 years of a story he had not been given the chance to choose. He had not been allowed to decide for himself. I had decided for him. In the fear of those first weeks, I had decided for both of us. I said, "I thought I was protecting you." He said, "I know. Diane told me that too." He said it without anger. He said it in the voice of someone who has had 6 months to move through anger and has arrived somewhere on the other side of it that is more complicated and more true. He said, "I would have stayed." I said, "I know." He said, "You didn't want me to stay because you thought staying would cost me something." I said, "Yes." He said, "It cost me 3 years anyway." What happened in the days that followed? Michael came back on Thursday and Friday and Saturday, not to resolve anything, not because we had decided anything, because the conversation that had started on Wednesday at 13:40 was long and could not be finished in one afternoon.
We talked about the 3 years, about what he had believed and what I had believed, and how two people can be separated by a silence that neither of them chose and both of them maintained. We talked about what had happened to him in those 3 years, things he had done, decisions he had made on the basis of a story I had written for him without his knowledge. We talked about what it meant to have been wrong in the way that I had been wrong, not dishonestly, not cruelly, but out of a love that had not trusted him enough to let him choose. I cried on Thursday afternoon, not about the diagnosis, about the 3 years. He did not tell me it was all right. He sat with it. That was the right thing.
My sister Cora came on Friday. She had known. She had always known why the marriage had ended. She had been the only person I had told the whole truth to. She came in and she looked at Michael sitting in the chair and she looked at me in the bed and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I always thought this would happen eventually." Michael said, "She was very convincing." Cora said, "She has always been very convincing. It is one of her most exhausting qualities." Michael laughed. "The real kind. I had not heard it for 3 years." Michael, I am not going to tell you that we resolved everything in a hospital room in 6 days. We did not. 3 years and a 17-year marriage and a diagnosis and a silence maintained by two people who were both trying to do the right thing do not resolve in 6 days. What I can tell you is this. He updated his own emergency contact list while I was in hospital. He showed me his phone on Saturday afternoon. His emergency contact was my name. It had always been my name. He had not changed it either. The emergency contact field. One entry on a phone I had carried for 3 years. His name in a field I had told myself I simply had not gotten around to clearing. The most honest thing I had done in 3 years. The thing that brought him to a hospital on a Thursday morning. The thing that gave us a Wednesday afternoon at 13:40 when the real conversation finally happened. I updated my GP registration when I was discharged. I updated my bank details. I updated the small administrative life of a woman who is reorganizing herself again. I did not update the emergency contact. I left his name where it had always been, where it has always belonged. Here is what 6 days in a hospital and one unchanged contact field taught me. The honest things we do when we are not looking are sometimes more truthful than the decisions we make deliberately. I had made a deliberate decision to let Michael go. I had executed it with great care and great pain and great conviction, and then I had not been able to remove his name from my phone. One small failure of the deliberate decision, one field left unchanged, and 3 years later it became the thing that mattered most. Pay attention to the things you cannot bring yourself to do, the names you cannot remove, the photographs you do not take down, the numbers you never stop knowing. They are telling you something that your deliberate decisions are not. They are the honest part, and they are worth listening to. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And subscribe. I am here every week with a new story. She woke up. He was there. He had never stopped being the one they would call.